On the 1st of November 1950, the struggle along the 38th parallel hung tenuously in the balance. The war in Korea that had begun so well for Kim Il-sung's Democratic Republic was rapidly turning into a disaster. After trapping the entire South Korean army in and around the port of Pusan, victory had seemed assured. The Battle of the Pusan Perimeter, as it's become known to history, was shaping up to be the final decisive engagement in a lightning and triumphant campaign to reunify the Korean peninsula under communist rule. Yet the daring amphibious landing at Incheon under General MacArthur, codenamed Operation Chromite, put an end to that lofty dream. As an avalanche of equipment began unloading at the docks, the men of the United States Marine Corps stormed forward at the head of a United Nations task force to liberate the capital city of Seoul, cutting off the Korean People's Army in the south of the country, while the Republic of Korea launched a vicious counterattack, sallying forth from their enclave with the fury and determination of a country resolved to keep its freedom at whatever the cost. Such a turnaround in military fortunes has rarely been seen throughout the entire history of warfare. But the United Nations coalition had one decisive advantage the North Koreans couldn't possibly hope to fight against. An advantage born from a doctrine established during the Second World War: American air supremacy. Between the United States Air Force and the US Navy, there were thousands of combat aircraft flying constant operations in support of the ground forces while undermining the strategic capability of North Korea to make war. B-29s, many of them crewed by veterans of the campaign against Japan, flattened Pyongyang from end to end. P-51 Mustangs, sporting the new F-51 designation, bombed and strafed every single road and railway line leading to the front lines, paralyzing enemy logistics, while F-4U Corsairs and F-9F Panthers launched from their carriers to prowl the landscape for any unfortunate troop concentration they could find, raining fiery death literally by the ton. And by November 1st, 1950, the United Nations forces were rapidly approaching the Yalu River on the Korean border with China, while a mountain range containing the last pockets of determined resistance stretched out eastwards towards the city of Chongqing. It seemed as though, at this late hour, victory was assured. And on the cold, frosty morning of this day in war-torn Korea, a flight of 15 F-51 Mustangs took off from their base near Seoul to lend their support in this final drive to end the war. Coming along with them was a nearby flight of F-80C Shooting Stars, sweeping the skies above for an enemy they knew didn't have an air force to intercept them. But those pilots were wrong. They were fatally wrong. As the flight of Mustangs broke off to strafe their targets, confused radio calls started coming in from the F-80s. They had made contact with a group of strange aircraft heading towards them, and they were incredibly fast. The Mustang pilots began turning their heads to spot the incoming bogies, only to realize it was already too late. A flash of silver, brushing against the speed of sound, blasted past the trailing aircraft, locked in on the leading element. They had no time at all to evade. First Lieutenant Aaron Abercrombie moved to cover his flight lead, but it was already over. 23mm cannon shells tore into his F-51, killing him instantly in a roaring sheet of flame as the wreck of his aircraft plummeted into the Korean countryside. The formation broke apart in a panic, trying to ascertain what had just happened, yet the fight had already moved on. A second squadron of F-80 Shooting Stars arrived on the scene to escort the strike package home, only to be descended upon out of the sun by 4 more silver cigar shapes, spitting columns of flame out of their noses. One of the F-80s disintegrated, while the rest of them broke off into wingman pairs and ran for their lives, straight towards home as fast as their engines could carry them. In the span of a day, the legendary myth of American air dominance had been shattered. Reports across the frontline squadrons began filtering in that these new jets had been seen all throughout the theatre that day, an aircraft unlike anything any of them had ever seen, an aircraft so overwhelming in its performance it rendered everything currently being fielded in Korea obsolete. Emergency phone calls were immediately made to the Pentagon, and the brand new F-86 Sabre by North American Aviation was hurriedly readied for deployment. Unlike the majority of their frontline pilots, The Air Force officials at the Pentagon knew the identity of their assailants, and it could only mean one thing. The Russians were coming. Except there is a twist to that story, because American records of the combat that day show that Abercrombie's Mustang was shot down by ground fire. In fact, it became common practice for both sides to claim that accidents or ground fire were responsible for aircraft losses, rather than enemy aircraft, as neither side wanted to admit that the enemy had bested one of their heroic aviators. And this is a trend that we have seen continue in recent times with the various conflicts around the world today, especially surrounding the ongoing war in Ukraine. So how do we go about figuring out who is telling the truth? Well, we do it with today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a long-time friend of the channel, and in this particular case, it's extra fitting because I'm also a regular customer. I use Ground News to keep track of what's going on in the media space, so I can pick articles for my political streams. It shows me which outlets are reporting on a story, what political bias they lean towards, who owns those outlets, and provides links to each article so you can read them for yourself. This article here, for example, is discussing the surprising change in policy from the White House regarding support for Ukraine, with Zelensky discussing plans to end the war favourably for the Western powers while finalising a deal on drones. It's really fun to click on the hard left and hard right opinion pieces to see what the extremes are saying about any given situation. Not only does it help you balance out your worldview, but it also provides you with hours of entertainment. You can see that the right-wing publications, especially from India, are loudly proclaiming that Putin is not scared of the West and will keep marching on to victory, while the mainstream outlets in the US and Europe are heralding in a new era of cooperation after all had seemed lost just a few months ago. It's very interesting watching the narratives ebb and flow depending on who is reporting. But my personal favourite feature of Ground News is Blind Spot, because it shows you articles that only one side of the political aisle is reporting. This is a useful tool to cut through all the nonsense algorithms that clog up social media and that prevent you from clicking away and checking other websites, while it also provides a fantastic source of comedic entertainment. I have spent many an hour scrolling through Blind Spot feed with the filter set to InfoWars. Oh, how I miss them. So trust me guys, in the words of the great Molly Meldrum, do yourself a favour and subscribe to Ground News by clicking on the link groundnews/animarchy in the description or pinned comment. Or if you're watching on PC, you can use your phone to scan this QR code. Doing it this way will help the channel, and more importantly, it'll help you get a 40% discount on the Ground News Vantage plan. And with that, thank you to Ground News for letting me engage in some shameless capitalism. Now let us return to the Soviet Union. Yet the question asked by the American pilots, the question asked by Western observers, and the question asked by those of you in the audience who don't know the story already, is how in the name of Karl Marx himself did the Soviet Union of all places build such a lethal and world-beating aircraft in such a short span of time? Which is an excellent question, because when we last left off, Alexander Yakovlev had just walked into Stalin's office and told him point blank that the German engines they'd copied and the indigenous project run by Ukraine's greatest mad scientist, Arkhip Lyulka, were both far below the required power output necessary and an absolute maintenance nightmare with service lives shorter than a modern attention span. Which is rather impressive really, given that, as we've established, the average service life of a Russian-built Junkers Yumo engine is less than the total runtime of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. They just didn't have the technological know-how in manufacturing or in metallurgy, nor did they have the skilled workforce that would allow them to develop and build a jet engine in a time frame that could reasonably compete with the Western powers, who at that very moment were surging ahead. At least when they could stop their own jets from surging, that is. We don't talk about the early days of General Electric jets for good reason. Ugh. Thank God for the Tizard mission and the American obsession with superchargers, otherwise this video would not be about the Soviet Union. But, speaking of the Tizard mission and the Soviet Union, as Yakovlev stood in Stalin's office explaining the ongoing woes of their jet engine development program, he made it clear that they were going to need to find a way to rapidly get ahead if they were to stand any chance of catching up to the West in terms of fighter design. They desperately needed a new engine. A better engine. An engine they couldn't make. And in the era of rising tensions of the new Cold War, stealing designs through espionage will be much harder to do. Yet even if they manage to get those designs, if they can't get a full set of blueprints along with a full guide to the raw materials along with their fabrication process, such as what type of alloys are used, how to make those alloys, the heat tolerances, the specifications of the compressor blades, etc, etc, without all that information, they might as well be making giant hairdryers for all the good it will do them, as any attempt to run them at a higher power setting will simply result in the engine melting or exploding. Or both, much like their German ones, just far more expensive. Simply put, they couldn't design an engine in time to catch up. Stealing a complete example of an engine is utterly impractical, and even if they managed to steal the blueprints to one, they didn't have the technology to build it. That left one option. They're going to have to buy one. Which is what Yakovlev told Stalin, who, after a long pause, looked him dead in the eye and asked with a voice dripping in sarcasm, What fool would sell us their secrets?
London. What a dump.
London's okay.
No, it's not. It's a dump.
The world's largest empire, a land on which the sun never sets, victor of history's largest and bloodiest war. But it sure as hell didn't feel like winning. With amicable Adolf and the spicy pinwheel gang thoroughly vanquished, the British people had, in short order, voted out the conservative government of Winston Churchill, who, just as he had with Nazi Germany, began sounding the alarm of the Soviet threat. Alas, to no avail. Uncle Joe at the time was ostensibly still an ally. They were comrades in the triumph over fascism. Relations were still, on the whole, rather genial. The thing was, though, everyone knew it wouldn't stay that way. Nevertheless, despite conspiracy theorists to this day postulating that the Labour government under Sir Clement Attlee was actually a socialist psyop hell-bent on spreading world communism, the material reality of the situation was something far more basic. The mighty and venerable British Empire was completely and utterly broke. World War II had devastated the urban centres of southern Britain. My father still tells me stories to this day of he and my uncles riding bikes into bomb craters that were still not filled in over 20 years later. But far worse than the material damage inflicted by the Luftwaffe was the total annihilation of Britain's finances. Wars are, above all things, expensive. And for a progressive government trying to rebuild a nation, start the world's first welfare state and comprehensive universal healthcare system, all while maintaining a global empire teetering on the brink of total collapse, this lack of cash flow had to be remedied by any means necessary, regardless of the risks. Oh, and before I forget, if you want to help me improve my cash flow, please remember to hit like and subscribe, and also comment what you think. It helps me in the algorithm, as they say. Also, if you want to support me financially, you can do so by joining my Patreon, which gives you access to the Discord and you get to chat to me, or you can use my promo code JDAM to get a discount on your gamer subs at checkout. With that out of the way, back in we go. And when you have spent the last 10 years preparing to fight and then subsequently fighting history's largest war, it means you've spent a decade building some of the world's most high-tech weaponry, including cavity magnetron radars, state-of-the-art anti-submarine warfare equipment, entire fleets of shipping for both military as well as civilian use, and of course, modern combat aircraft, complete with shiny brand new jet engines. Now, normally, all of this stuff would be tightly restricted under arms control laws to prevent state secrets from being leaked to potential adversaries. In the arms markets of today, you can't just walk up and buy an F-22 or the M1 Abrams X. The US government will look at you and then laugh at the sheer hubris to think you'd be able to afford them, let alone if they'd even consider letting you buy them. Which they wouldn't. But the British were, as we've established, broke-ass bitches to the nth degree. So the moment Japan decided to endure the unendurable after having the sun dropped on them twice and unconditionally surrendered, Britain immediately began slashing defence as much as possible, while still being able to meet their coalition commitments as armies of occupation. And then once that was done, they proceeded to list what amounted to their entire arsenal of top-secret military equipment on the open market. Quite literally everything was for sale, regardless of how advanced or proprietary the technology and the systems were. This went to the extent that Sir Stafford Cripps, the president of Britain's Board of Trade, directly conspired with British industry magnates to lobby the government in Whitehall for the removal of as many export safeguards as possible in order to dominate the global market. This included removing the requirement for prior government approval on finalising sales. And to be fair, this would end up being an extremely successful venture, with Rolls-Royce still dominating the aero engine market to this very day as a result. Yet you can probably guess, dear viewers, risky ventures, while often very profitable, usually have unforeseen consequences. And in this case, those consequences would change the entire course of human history. When the Board of Trade opened up their aggressive new export policy, everyone responded enthusiastically and immediately started making opening bids, with the British offering to sell state-of-the-art technology not just as a wholesaler, but as a licensee for domestic production. The various nations of the world could rebuild their militaries, as well as their domestic industrial sectors, without having to go through the arduous process of large-scale development from the ground up. All they had to do was hire a British corporation, provide the startup capital along with the facilities to build stuff in, and that country could have a factory set up and brand new products rolling off the line after just a month or two. And within mere weeks of Rolls-Royce putting their jet engines up on the market, those opening bids became successful sales conversions. Several countries signed massive procurement orders with the goal of fostering domestic production. Canada, France, Argentina, even Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China got in on the action. But there was one member of the Allied coalition who wasn't happy about this. That member was the United States of America. President Truman, like Attlee, was coping with the post-war drawdown, and his industrialists were just as eager to get access to some of those sweet Marshall Plan Reconstruction dollars while buying up as much European intellectual property as they could get their hands on. And when I say the US was getting aggressive on trade policy, I mean they were ruthless. They had corporate liquidator squads following the US Army around during the war. They asset stripped practically every company in Germany after the war ended, including a chemical company that provided certain things to certain facilities. They're now one of America's largest pesticide manufacturers, by the way. Anyway, the point is, the United States government knew. They knew that global economic hegemony was within their reach. They could control the global economy. They were the only major nation that hadn't been razed to the ground by World War II, and the massive economic growth the conflict had given them laid the foundations for complete dominion over international trade. And a key part of controlling that trade meant holding on to their supremacy in defense technology and keeping the other major powers dependent on them, both financially and militarily. But now, with the British allowing the purchase and licensed production of what were at the time the best jet engines in the world, this threatened to force American companies out of both the military and civil aviation markets, while giving various nations the opportunity to develop their military capabilities independently and be self-sufficient for their defense. Except now, with the threat of communism beginning to rear its head as the civil war in China started deteriorating, the US government refused to lift the export restrictions on their military equipment for fears that their best gear would end up in the hands of the Red Menace. That's a wild concept. I'm sure this won't be relevant. This, of course, caused some serious tensions between the United Kingdom and the United States governments, especially over the sale of jet engines to Juan Perón's dictatorship in Argentina, who had a lot of German aviation professionals working there for some unknown, unrelated reason. But these tense trade relations and the outrage of American companies desperately lobbying Washington for permission to sell their goods had its own unintended consequence. This emerging trade war with the UK, which honestly deserves a video of its own because it gets rather ridiculous, tipped their hand to the British Board of Trade, who suddenly realised that the Americans, despite being the world's dominant economic power, not only wouldn't sell their defense technology, they legally couldn't sell their defense technology. Which meant if the British military industries deregulated completely, they could launch a takeover of the entire global arms trade right out from under their noses. And so, after yet another round of lobbying, Sir Stafford Cripps at the Board of Trade successfully managed to remove the final layer of government oversight on arms exports to foreign countries. If those arms were on the open list for sale, they could be sold without any approval required. With this done, he then subsequently had the very latest jet engines purposely added to that open list, those engines being the Rolls-Royce Derwent and the Rolls-Royce Nene respectively. And these were added along with complete examples of modern jet fighters, such as the Meteor and the Vampire. This decision, as you can imagine, naturally sent the Ministry of Defence into total meltdown, who loudly protested to the government to prevent the sale of these advanced systems to any nation, let alone potential adversaries. With the budget cuts being made to the RAF at the time, this new policy could result in the distinct likelihood that foreign countries would be fully equipped with British jet fighters before the Royal Air Force would be. But be that as it may, the original calculus still remained. We need money, and this is the best way to get it. In any case, the only people who are likely to buy this technology are either allies or third parties in South America or Asia who are unlikely to pose an immediate threat to British national security. And GCHQ doesn't expect any major conflicts to break out until the mid to late 50s at the earliest, by which time Rolls-Royce will have finished their AJ65 project, codenamed Avon. So retaining technical superiority should not be a problem. Besides, no one else in the world could possibly replicate our far superior manufacturing methods. Enter Vladimir Yakovlevich Klimov, hero of the Soviet Union, genius designer of aero engines, and genius really doesn't do this man justice. This man, despite living in a bureaucratic authoritarian hellscape of a country that has literally tried to kill him and all of his friends more than once, all while having, as we've established, no industrial base or skilled labour pool, stared down the most complicated field of engineering at the time, the design and construction of high-performance aero engines. He stared that challenge directly in the face and said, "Nah, I'd win." Which brings us back to that dreary Moscow day in April of 1946, after Yakovlev proposed that the Soviet Union should offer to buy as many top-of-the-line jets that Rolls-Royce would sell them. You see, Stalin, even after cautiously approving the trade mission to the UK, didn't believe the British would be stupid enough to sell him systems that would single-handedly catapult Soviet aviation into direct contention with the West. Thus, as soon as Yakovlev left his office, Stalin gave orders to summon the best engine designers in the Soviet Union and have them begin work on a next-generation jet design, comparable to the Rolls-Royce Nene, capable of propelling a fighter to 1,000 kilometers an hour, using whatever intelligence they could gather to develop a purely indigenous design. And, given that Arkhipylyulka was already busy developing high-powered axial flow turbojets, the task to design a high-powered centrifugal engine was assigned to Bureau OKB-117, the project to be led by its gifted chief designer, Vladimir Klimov. Now, given what we know about the struggle the Soviets had with the manufacture of BMW and Junkers turbojets, asking Klimov to build an engine from scratch to compete with and, if possible, defeat Rolls-Royce designed jet engines is not just a tall order, it's asking the near impossible. And yet, one has to consider two decisive factors. One, you don't say no to Stalin, under any circumstances. And two, this is motherfucking Vladimir Klimov, and he achieves engineering miracles. So, having received his orders from the General Secretary, he immediately got to work assembling as much data as possible on the latest Rolls-Royce designs available in the public aviation press. The KGB, I know they weren't actually called that yet, but they went through like 5, maybe 6 different name changes before switching to that name after Beria rightfully got his ass shot for being a gigantic piece of shit.
Get him out! Come on! Get out of here! Well, that's got it done. Come on!
The KGB, air quotes, were sent out with explicit instructions from Klimov to buy everything publicly available on the Derwent Mark V and the Nien Mark I, along with any intel that could be gleaned from their active sources inside the UK. He bought journals, newspapers, engineering textbooks, serial publications. Literally any information, no matter how small, was compiled into a database, corroborated with research data available from both Sagi and tactically acquired information from agents in place throughout the British government. Once this had been done, he then, and I have to remind you, he was doing this from scratch, using fragmented, publicly available information. He then began using his engineering brilliance to combine theoretical knowledge with educated guesses about the internal construction of the engine, and designed a centrifugal jet 30% more powerful than the Nien, all while factoring in the limitations of Soviet materials and manufacturing processes into the design. The Klimov VK-1 was and is to this day an engineering marvel. However, when they began building it, they immediately ran into the same old problems they had before. Their thrust output wasn't matching the projected specifications, and their metallurgical technology was nowhere near adequate to the task. Furthermore, the design, while a huge leap ahead for Soviet aero engines and jet technology in general, required thousands of man-hours to build, only for the entire thing to melt within 50 hours of use. There were a considerable number of reliability issues with the design as a whole, most pressing of which being they hadn't worked out how to make the turbine blades retain their shape through continuous operation, which caused them to warp and then fracture, eventually breaking, shattering, getting sucked into the intake and the compression chambers, which, well, destroys the engine. But it did work. Briefly. And when it worked, it was superior to the Nien. With enough time and resources, these issues would invariably be fixed. But the entire point of this operation was to catch up to the West, and so that precious commodity of time was the one commodity they didn't have. Thus, they needed a complete example of an engine to find out just how the British managed to resolve all these issues. As such, in May of 1946, the Soviet Trade Commission in London, with no preamble or warning, placed an order for 10 examples of all the latest Rolls-Royce jet engines currently on the open list for sale. And this immediately got the attention of everyone involved. The British government in Whitehall sat up straight in their chairs and had an oh shit moment. They had listed the engines on the open mark on the recommendation from the Board of Trade, overruling the Ministry of Defence in the process, as we know. They had done so on the assumption that Commonwealth countries, allies, and neutral third parties would purchase production licenses. No one had even considered the possibility of the Soviets making an offer. Everyone naturally concluded that Stalin would be far too paranoid to even think about a defence contract, let alone actually proposing one. Yet here were the communists standing in front of them with their checkbooks eagerly open, which naturally led to the other reaction. Rolls-Royce started seeing gigantic dollar signs. Well, in this case, pound sterling signs, but you get the idea. The moment the order came in, the company executives approved the sale instantly with Sir Stafford Cripps' full endorsement. Imagine, the largest country in the world, with the world's fastest growing military-industrial sector, entirely reliant on Rolls-Royce products and technical expertise. Now yes, the Russians have a habit of blatantly copying things, and yes, communists ideologically as well as practically don't recognize international corporate copyright laws. Just ask Intel about where their industrial CPU share went in the early 90s. Thanks, China. Very cool. But there are allies. Fellow vanquishers of the mustache man. The little mustache man, I mean. Surely we can trust them, right? Of course not. Trusting Russia geopolitically at any point in history is generally a bad idea. Just ask Napoleon. But during the Soviet era, you'd have to be drunk, insane, or incredibly desperate to even consider such a course of action. Which was fortunate for Stalin, because Britain was most definitely desperate in more ways than just being broke. And as a wise man once said, People assume history is a simple exercise of cause and effect, but it's actually more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey history-distory stuff. So everybody prepare yourselves, because here comes yet another tangent. Remember when I started this ever-lengthening chapter talking about Britain's battle against the Luftwaffe? Apart from the existential financial crisis plaguing the country, the relentless bombing of major urban centres in southern England while inflicting serious damage was not anything like as lethal as the bombing campaign against the Axis. This was due to a number of factors, but primarily it was down to the smaller scale of the air raids, the lack of bombing concentration as a result of that, and the magnificently designed Anderson air raid shelter, one of which being the reason I exist to write this video. Fun fact, my family has the distinct honour of being fired at with every form of Luftwaffe munition used during the war. My great-grandma's house was even deleted by a V1, while she was sheltering in the basement. Yet therein lies the issue. She survived, as did almost everyone else. Only 70,000 British citizens were killed by the Luftwaffe or the vengeance weapons during the entire war. And I can already hear you asking the question, why is that a bad thing? That's a good thing, isn't it? I mean, you exist to write this video. Thousands of lives, tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of lives were saved. Isn't that a good thing? Yes, it most definitely is, self-preservation notwithstanding, except for the fact that over 500,000 homes were destroyed, meaning approximately now 750,000 people were homeless and living in temporary accommodation or as evacuees in the countryside. Not to mention that the rest of Britain's inner-city suburbs were all from the Georgian or Victorian era and desperately needed modernising. No indoor toilets, no central heating. Look, post-war Britain was incredibly grim. In fact, I probably didn't need to specify post-war. Britain is just grim in general. And as a result of this grim situation, the monolithic council estate towers you see ruining the skyline of every major British population centre was born and built out of this very same crisis. A crisis shared with the Soviets, resulting in the supremely ironic and little-known fact that it was the United Kingdom who invented the commie bloc before the communists, only to make them somehow even more depressing. It doesn't matter how many fancy colours you put in the windows, Sheffield City Council, it is still a commie bloc. Now, the reason that this is important to our story is that the Soviets, either via a cunning plan or by sheer luck, had made their purchasing offer at the exact same moment a British trade mission was in Moscow negotiating for a massive import agreement on timber, along with various other construction materials like concrete, steel, etc., etc. Construction materials they desperately needed to resolve the aforementioned housing crisis. If they didn't solve this issue while simultaneously raising revenue via arms sales, the government would collapse, the economy would implode, and the British people would lose that famous stiff upper lip of theirs, because not having a house or food makes the working class of any nation rather upset. And if the members of the trade mission to Moscow doubted that fact, they could just ask the local state officials how they got their jobs in the first place. They couldn't very well ask Tsar Nicholas II or any of his staff, could they? In fact, they could probably ask the Red Army officers on their security detail how the end of that story went as well. Anyway, this all posed a serious diplomatic quandary. On the one hand, the Air Ministry, Foreign Office, and Ministry of Defense loudly opposed any sale of advanced military technology of any kind to the Soviet Union on sheer principle. They are ideologically opposed to the British Empire in every regard and pose the greatest strategic threat to the UK's national security, either directly by invading Western Europe or via insurrection throughout the colonies and the Commonwealth. See the Malayan Emergency, the Viet Minh, the IRA, and basically the entire Middle East, including a bunch of Arab nationalist movements and one really angry Jewish one. And on top of all of these concerns, the Foreign Office also raised the issue of losing Britain's leading position in aerospace and aero engine development. At the time, estimates from the Ministry of Defense placed Soviet jet development at around 5 years behind that of Britain's. Estimates on metallurgical technology and industrial development were even more optimistic at between 5 to 10 years behind. However, if the sale of these engines were to go ahead, this distinct strategic advantage could be reduced to a 3-year gap across the board. And if they made the huge mistake of licensing production, this could potentially wipe out the British technological advantage entirely, leading to the Soviets fielding superior aircraft to the RAF at scale by the end of 1947. A terrifying image flashed into the minds of the RAF's senior leadership. Hordes of Nien-powered Russian fighters laying waste to the Allied air forces as T-34s advance on Paris. A horrific authoritarian regime bent on conquest, once again lurking just across the channel as clouds of radioactive fallout drift over the darkened continent. With this terrifying potential future in mind, the Foreign Office tried to make the argument that proliferation of Rolls-Royce engines to non-Allied powers would compromise their lead in technology in general, let alone to a strategic enemy, resulting in a massive loss of potential revenue for the British aircraft industry just when they have the opportunity to establish a global monopoly on both military and civil aviation exports, be they airframes or engines. To quote the Deputy Foreign Secretary,
"I feel we are in danger of getting the worst of both worlds. I am convinced that if we allow Messrs. Rolls-Royce to go through with their contracts for the manufacture of engines under license in China and in France, and in future elsewhere, we shall, in fact, be giving the information and the industrial know-how to the Soviet Union in an indirect way. In the case of China, nothing, I am sure, would be easier for the Russians than to place their agents in a Chinese factory with access to all the technical information which we give to the Chinese. I think we must face the fact that the same position is true in regard to the French contract with Hispano-Suiza. Many French technicians are Communist Party members, and the present head of the French Ministry of Armaments and War Production is a communist."
These arguments, however, would fall on deaf ears, because, as always, while the military and industry experts can offer all the opinions they want on a subject, there are two things in our capitalist society that override everything else: political expediency and corporate profit. The Board of Trade, despite the analysts showing that the potential loss in revenue due to an oversaturated market and the dissemination of proprietary technology would far outweigh the short-term gains made in the engine market, Sir Stafford Cripps and Rolls-Royce executives were confident that they could maintain the technological lead using the Avon engine, arguing that as they had sold the Nien to a number of friendly countries, which the Soviets almost certainly had spies in, they would probably be able to replicate the Nien and Derwent designs regardless of if they prevented the sale, and that still wouldn't solve the deficiencies in Soviet metallurgy. Not to mention, if we don't let them buy it, despite us already having exported it to literally anyone with a checkbook, we are publicly stating that we consider the USSR a hostile nation. And while the Cold War was already well underway, everyone is still recovering from the actual war, and we will be seen as inflaming geopolitical tensions, purposely rejecting a trade deal made in good faith on the open market from a former comrade in arms. We will look like complete pricks internationally, which in fairness is normal for the British Empire, except for the fact that we are currently in the middle of high-stakes trade negotiations in Moscow. What do you think the Soviet Trade Commission will do the instant we tell them no? We can kiss that massive import deal on timber goodbye for a start, let alone the kind of financial and political pressure they'll put on us in occupied Germany. And if the trade deals with the Soviet Union fall through, if our foreign policy implodes the tenuous peace in Europe everyone has fought so hard for, undermining our French and American allies in the process no less, all while rendering nearly 1 million of our citizens to homelessness, what do you think that's going to do to the government? We'd be lucky if we won a council seat, let alone a general election. His Majesty the King could potentially fire the entire administration if we screw up this badly, and just imagine what Churchill will do to us in the press. And as for Rolls-Royce's perspective, well, their position was actually really quite simple. Profit. They sensed the possibility of securing not just the Western market, but the entire Eastern Bloc as well. Sure, the ruble was worth, and still is worth, just over the paper it's printed on. Yet if every Soviet bloc country currently under reconstruction were to purchase Rolls-Royce engines for their aviation sector, the prestige they got would only be eclipsed by the possible royalties they could earn. They knew assuming the communists would actually pay those royalties was dubious at best, but even if they got just a percentage of those royalties as lip service, it would be a huge profit margin and look fantastic on the quarterly balance sheet. Everyone could get a nice bonus and go on holiday to Cornwall for the summer. Except, just as the sale was about to be confirmed, the government had a rush of blood to the brain, regained their common sense, stepped back in, and put on the brakes. There was just too much to consider between the two arguments before it could be approved. And the ensuing interdepartmental shit show that followed from this dispute was immense, sending shockwaves throughout the entire British government. The Home Office, the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office, the Board of Trade, the Ministry of Housing and Local Government, His Majesty's Treasury Office, even the Department of Education got in on the action regarding the potential brain drain of young British engineers going to work for the Soviets, which made life a living hell for MI5. Though, ironically enough, that was already happening anyway, as British academia was riddled with KGB informants throughout the Cold War, especially among the civil service applicants. One of them, Kim Philby, almost got promoted to the top of MI6 before he was caught. Imagine the head of British foreign intelligence being a Soviet spy. Yeah, that's a terrifying thought. Anyway, this bureaucratic car crash went on for several months, to the fury of the Soviet Trade Commission, who considered the halt of the sale as a hostile act, showing discrimination against the Soviet Union in the open market, immediately stonewalling on the construction materials trade agreement in response. Rolls-Royce, meanwhile, went into crisis mode. They had ramped up production to meet all these purchase orders from half the planet, and now their prestige customer, who could potentially place orders in the thousands, has just been blocked by their own government. Their solution to this was to demand a letter from the Board of Trade stating categorically that it wasn't Rolls-Royce's fault that the deal wasn't going through. They literally asked for a letter saying, "Hey, comrades, don't blame us, blame Clement Attlee and the Labour Party. They're the ones stopping fraternal cooperation of engineers across nations. We have nothing but solidarity with our fellow industrial workers in the Soviet Union." I swear to you, I'm not making this up. I'm not joking. I'm 100% serious. Rolls-Royce literally asked for the international trade equivalent of a doctor's note. Meanwhile, over at the Board of Trade, Sir Stafford Cripps promptly went into full lobbyist mode and went directly to Prime Minister Attlee personally, making the case for allowing the sale by saying the following.
Here is a field in which we lead the world, and in which we may expect a very valuable export trade. If we stifle it, do we not risk hampering the firms whose research is producing such remarkable results?
And he didn't stop there. He made case after case, argument after argument to the cabinet, while simultaneously leveraging his contacts among the military-industrial complex to exert pressure on the various members of parliament responsible for the districts their factories were in, demanding that they take action for the voters in their electorates, who would suffer without these much-needed jobs. That's right, American cousins. If you guys in the United States thought you were the only ones with this problem, don't worry. You can rest assured this political corruption shit in the defense sector is universal across the entire Western world. The industrialists will have their profits, regardless of the consequences. And this political pressure, combined with Britain's dire financial problems, exacerbated by the housing crisis that was in turn causing a diplomatic crisis in Moscow, forced the Prime Minister's hand. They needed the money. They needed the Soviet trade deal for construction materials. The aviation sector needed to keep as many jobs as possible to stave off a post-war recession. And even though the RAF, the MOD, MI5 and the Foreign Office would have a collective conniption fit over the decision, money and political expedience comes before national security. Every single time. So, on September 26, 1946, Clement Attlee would approve the sale of Rolls-Royce engines to the Soviet Union, explaining his reasoning in the following memo. Clearly, the engines could be procured elsewhere as a prototype if they want to manufacture one. I can see no good reason withholding them from the Soviet Union, whereas refusal of their sale will only cause much trouble and suspicion. He was taking a risk, and he knew it. But the Rolls-Royce team assured both him and the Ministry of Defense that the upcoming axial flow Avon engine would retain their market-leading position, and that the Soviets could not possibly have the technology, metallurgy, manufacturing techniques, or skilled enough engineers to reliably replicate the designs within a reasonable time frame. As Air Marshal William Elliott said, trying to put a positive spin on the situation, "If we can safeguard the production methods of the mnemonic alloys used in our engines, the security implications should be limited."
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
Thus, with the sale having been officially signed off on by the Prime Minister, Rolls-Royce immediately shipped 10 Neens and 10 Derwent Mark Vs to the Soviet Union, and once they arrived in Moscow, it took less than a day for an example of each engine to be sitting in Klimov's workshop, steadily being disassembled, with every single component down to the individual bolts being labelled and meticulously catalogued. It would take less than a month for a full set of technical drawings to be produced, with the Soviet Neen being prepared for production under the designation RD-45. As this was happening, a team of engineers from various Soviet aviation technology bureaus visited Rolls-Royce's engine testing facilities and their staff training centre, taking in every piece of information they could glean from the processes that were demonstrated for their benefit. I mean, after all, if they were going to operate the engines, they're going to need to know how to maintain them, even if the government isn't approving a production license yet. That may happen in the very near future, and we here at Rolls-Royce are very keen to expand our contract and... Nigel, how do you say please buy our stuff in Russian? Anyway, after having secured access to these technical details, an approximation of their personnel training, and a cursory look into the Rolls-Royce production processes, Klimov's team was able to reverse engineer and fully replicate a rough prototype Rolls-Royce Neen in their workshop at Factory 45. However, the same issues that plagued their work on the VK1 were even worse on the RD-45, as the copied engine was obviously designed using British engineering and manufacturing processes in mind. The man-hours required to build it were in the tens of thousands, while the reliability and service life were far worse. Rolls-Royce, despite having a factory that could meet high-demand orders, was still at their core a boutique company making specialist products. They still did a lot of their work by hand, and there were nowhere near as many automated processes or machine tools used in their engine's construction when compared to Soviet or American designs. This went to the extent that during World War II, when Packard licensed production of the Rolls-Royce Merlin for use in the P-51, they had to make a number of engineering changes and simplifications to make the engine suitable for mass production in order to meet the US Army Air Force's operational requirements in terms of numbers. So while the Soviets could successfully copy the Rolls-Royce Neen as a finished product, and even though they had a detailed rundown of how to maintain, operate and sustain the engine in service, they didn't have the technicians or the manufacturing setup to efficiently replicate them. It would be far too expensive in time and resources to train tens of thousands of artisanal specialist engineers solely dedicated to one type of jet engine, and then have them spend millions of hours building just a few hundred workable examples with acceptable performance and maintenance tolerances. The facts were right there in front of them. After months of 80-hour weeks, even with multiple Rolls-Royce jet engines in their possession, without knowing exactly how their engineers made the alloys and constructed the delicate internal components, specifically the compressor and its fan blades, they were right back to square one. Thus why the British government specifically forbade their various aviation companies to sell licensing contracts and complex technical data to the Soviets. They did it for this exact reason, and it appeared that their gamble had paid off. The Soviets just couldn't catch up by simply copying the design. And yet, they had made a critical error of their own. They had sorely underestimated just how good Soviet engineers were. They had no idea that Klimov had already built an engine of his own, better than theirs more or less, and thanks to his work on the Rolls-Royce Neen Moscow had purchased, Klimov and his team were able to fix almost every single remaining problem he'd had. All he needed to do now was to solve the metallurgical issues. If he could just manage that, the Soviet Union would have a mass production jet engine that could beat anything in the West's arsenal. And after dealing with this one problem as well as the British government for over 6 months at this point, he came to the conclusion that there was really only one way to do this properly, while meeting his very tight deadlines. And I promise you, dear viewers, no, actually, I need to swear to you, what follows from here on is a true story. In the second half of November 1946, the Soviet Union announced it would be launching the international debut of its new jet-powered aircraft at that year's Paris Indoor Air Show. And as such, models of the very latest in Soviet aircraft were packed up and shipped to France, complete with a delegation from the major design bureaus, along with senior Red Air Force officers. Vladimir Klimov went himself, along with several of his senior engineers, to get a closer look at what the other nations were doing regarding jet technology and jet engines. But he also had an ulterior motive. Rolls-Royce, along with the other major British manufacturers, had their own pavilions at the show, demonstrating some of their new designs. This would give him the opportunity to talk to the Rolls-Royce engineers directly while examining how they integrated their engines with various control systems on British aircraft. After reaching the show and visiting the various exhibits, Klimov got to talking to the executive in charge of the Rolls-Royce display about the newer version of the Neen in comparison to the Mark I they had in Moscow. Hey, that's an idea. We're actually thinking about expanding our engine order for a new airliner Tupolev is developing. I mean, after all, your government said we had to use your engines for civilian use, so I don't suppose we could, bring our exhibition team here to the UK to come and visit your factory? I mean, it would be a fantastic opportunity to examine some of your other products. I mean, we've been working on integrating the Neen with one of our prototypes, but we've hit some hurdles, we're running into some issues, and the insight of your engineers would be most valuable. The charm offensive was in full swing, and as Klimov was making this overture, the Soviet Trade Office in London submitted requests to follow up their purchase and expand their order to include more Rolls-Royce engines and various examples of British combat jets also on the open export list, namely the de Havilland Vampire and Gloucester Meteor. Now, given that Prime Minister Attlee had approved the sale of the engines and the construction materials deal was already up for approval from Stalin, the Soviet aviation delegation was approved for a trade mission to the United Kingdom to visit various manufacturers and their facilities. However, a final decision on the purchase of aircraft would be on hold until further details were established for bilateral trade. Starting in early December, what amounted to a who's who of the Soviet aviation industry landed in the UK. Joining them was a full diplomatic contingent, including officials from the Soviet Trade Commission, the aircraft designer turned Air Force military attaché Mikhail Pashinin, and most importantly of all, the Soviet Union's chief metallurgist, Sergei Timofeyevich Kishkin. Throughout the month, they toured every major aviation company in Britain. They visited Gloucester, de Havilland, Vickers, English Electric, Bristol. But of course, the main event was their tour of the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby. The night before the tour, the Soviets had engaged in some psychological warfare and diplomatic brinkmanship. While having a casual drink with several Rolls-Royce executives, one of the members of the Soviet delegation challenged the British to a game of billiards. Now, the game Russians are famously known for playing is chess, not pool, so the arrogant Anglos readily accepted the match, not realizing that the leader of the aircraft design contingent of the delegation was an absolutely terrifying hustler. Turns out, even in the Soviet Union, college students are still broke as hell. So, to make some extra rubles on the side, he would take advantage of some of the drunken older denizens of downtown Moscow over the pool table. And they were supposedly playing a high-stakes game on the international stage. For their wager for the evening was apparently whether or not Rolls-Royce would approve the sale of some extra engines. Naturally, of course, this is almost certainly an embellishment. No major sale of a politically sensitive item would ever be settled over a bet, let alone something like this. Yet we do know that a game of pool was played, and that the Rolls-Royce team got completely and utterly obliterated. So when the sun rose the next morning, the Soviet delegation arrived to the factory on time at around 10 AM in a good mood. Albeit both groups were slightly hungover, but when doing business with people from Eastern Europe, alcohol indulgence is part of the bargaining process. They started the tour, as you always do, at the entrance, talking about the facility, how many staff they had, the standard corporate spiel you get whenever you get a new job at a new office, like, look at our shiny facilities, look at our state-of-the-art infrastructure, check out our fun break room, that sort of thing. Then, after going through the rigmarole of politely listening to a canned sales pitch, they finally got to what they were really here to see: the start of the production line, at which they found a team of expert craftsmen working on industrial lathes. And on those lathes were internal components of Rolls-Royce Derwent engines being machined down to meet exacting specifications. Seeing this, Klimov immediately asked the Rolls-Royce tour guide if he could go and talk to the machinists, which was granted. Now at this point it should be mentioned that the Soviets have been talking to every engineer in every facility they've visited so far. They've been trying to find out how their mnemonic alloys are made for their engines, and it's become very apparent that all the engineers have been briefed by management, most likely on behalf of MI5, to not discuss any specific details regarding the metallurgy of their components. And the same thing happens here. However, Klimov didn't care. He knew they'd deflect. He knew they wouldn't answer his questions. That wasn't his game plan. You see, after having been frustrated at every turn with this nonsense, he came up with an idea. Even having access to an engine, even having all the schematics, he didn't have access to the raw, untreated, unmachined metal. Yet here at the start of the production line, the machinists working the lathes have just been working on a fresh set of components. And with all the noise in the factory, he would have had to have been standing right next to them in order to make conversation. Which means standing in the giant swath of metal shavings coming off of the lathes. And Vladimir Klimov was wearing soft-soled shoes. I swear to God, no joke, this man went full James Bond. He planned out the entire operation, the entire conversation, everything, just to get into a situation where he could collect raw metal samples by standing in the waste shavings, and then same day shipping them in the diplomatic bag back to Moscow for analysis. But that, as cool as it is, isn't the funniest part. Oh no. The funniest part is Sergei Kishkin, the metallurgist, who literally pulled a move from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. He waited for the tour guide to move on ahead without him. He hung out at the back of the group to chat with the line workers like a good communist. You know, you gotta show that working class solidarity. He wanted to see how they managed to assemble the internal components. I mean, after all, he's going to be one of the people responsible for maintaining them. He stood there, watching them work, waiting for the tour group to move on ahead, taking the definitely not MI5 security escort with them. And the moment one of the workers went out for a smoke or went to have a shit, he walked up to the intake of a half-assembled engine and just yanked a compressor blade right out of it, stuck it in his pocket, and walked out like an absolute Chad as if nothing happened. And he got away with it like the legend he is. Absolutely incredible. And so, after the tour wrapped up, everyone shook hands and went back to the hotel. Their little piece of corporate espionage far more successful than anyone had hoped for. They had samples of the raw mnemonic alloys they needed, as well as a complete example of a compressor blade. Kishkin and his colleagues could use these to reverse engineer, or at the very least, develop an alloy from materials available in the Soviet Union. And with that, they would be in business. And it was a good thing they had succeeded too, because when news came through that the Soviets not only wanted more engines, but they wanted planes as well, the RAF finally put their foot down. As Secretary of State for Air Noel Baker said to Prime Minister Attlee,
"The supply of these aircraft will give the Russians tactical knowledge of the latest RAF frontline fighters. What is more important, it may reduce the technical lead which we have over the Russians in this field by from 18 months to 2 years. Moreover, since the Meteors will be an RAF frontline fighter for some 4 years, we might well be faced at the end of that period with Russian interceptor aircraft equal to those of the RAF. We have been watching with ever-increasing uneasiness the growth of the Soviet Air Force and the steps being taken to modernize it. We cannot help contrasting its size with the present very reduced strength of the RAF and our small aircraft production program. Previously, we had been able to feel that we could answer Russian numbers in the air with superior British quality, but this possibility is seriously reduced by our giving the Russians some of our own jet aircraft."
Not that this was news to the Prime Minister. He knew the Soviets were trying to play him, it was obvious. The only reason you'd want to buy a small number of aircraft compared to the larger engine purchase is to see how British manufacturers set up their avionics to work with their power plants. Otherwise, you'd just buy a production license for the aircraft type at a fixed rate per airframe. But he couldn't very well just cancel everything without running into the same problems that got him into this mess in the first place. So, he decided on a compromise. More engine sales were fine, you can buy as many engines as you want. However, if you want to buy the planes, an equivalent exchange of technology would have to take place. Those new IS-3 heavy tanks of yours look nice. We'd like a few of those in return for our aircraft, or maybe an example of that new rifle your boy, what was his name? Kalashnikov, that guy? We'd like some of his rifles. Oh, and don't ask me how we know about that. Of course, naturally, Stalin would reject this course of action, and the British knew that he would. Yet that didn't matter, because the Soviets had gotten everything they needed. With excellent engineers like Klimov, Sukhoi, Lyulka, and Tupolev, they had the designers and the materials, not to mention the rather unlucky German experts they'd recently, how would you put it? Aggressively recruited, currently taking up space in those R&D gulags used during the Great Purge. Though at least they got to bring their families, unlike the Soviet engineers back in the day. It would take some time to reverse engineer the complex alloys they'd tactically acquired, but it was made a national priority, and Comrade Kishkin and his team were already on the case. Eventually, they would come up with their own mnemonic alloy capable of replicating the heat tolerances of Rolls-Royce's engines, albeit with a much shorter lifespan due to lower thermal creep resistance, that being the alloy's resistance to heat deformation over an extended period of use. This alloy was designated KHN80T, and it changed the entire game. Yes, they'd have to do a full overhaul every 100 hours or so. However, with the adaptations made for Soviet mass production techniques, they could build thousands of these engines at a time across several factories. Once again, the tried and true method of Soviet engine manufacture comes in clutch. If thing breaks lots, make lots of replacement things. After a year of extremely hard work filled with endless testing, trial and error, sleepless nights, and, as we saw, literally playing James Bond, by the latter half of 1947, the Soviet Union had its engines. The RD-45 Neen was in production, and the indigenous VK-1 was in the final stages of development. All they needed now was a fighter to put them in. Which is where, humble viewers, we finally return to the main plot of the story. Except, we've already started talking about it. Because, do you remember the head of the aviation design department of the trade mission to the UK? The pool hustler who stomped the Rolls-Royce execs over the billiard table? Well, that man was none other than the brother of the Soviet Union's trade minister and the chief designer of OKB-155, Artyom Mikoyan. And he, along with his colleague Mikhail Gurevich, had been working on a design to meet the 1,000 km/h fighter specification set out by the Ministry of Aviation. All he was waiting for was an engine. And that really does sum up the greatest of engineering projects, doesn't it? From the first great ocean liners to the Saturn V rocket roaring towards the moon, it is never the work of solely one man or just one technical innovation. It is the culmination of thousands of components, both metaphorical and literal, coming together to form something truly great. And in the case of Soviet aviation, on their own, each one of these threads was a long and troubled struggle for progress, facing setbacks at every turn. 20 years of concentrated effort. Individually, these hard-won achievements of the Soviet aviation industry were fragile. They were almost useless, like tiny wooden twigs. Yet when these little twigs, these useless sticks, are bundled together, they would form a mighty and powerful After the absolute disaster that was the MiG-9, it seems almost inconceivable that arguably the greatest success story in the history of Soviet aviation would be designed by exactly the same team less than a year later. But that is precisely what happened. though how it happened is still a matter of heated patriotic debate between Western and Eastern scholars to this day. You see, the development of the prototype, designated I-310, later to be known as the MiG-15, was achieved in a miraculously short time and encountered practically none of the systemic issues that have plagued Soviet aircraft designers thus far in our story. From the confirmed acquisition of the Rolls-Royce Nene in late 1946, through the design of the airframe, until the prototype of the MiG-15 made its first flight, it was roughly a year of development, with the I-310 making its first flight on the 30th of December 1947. That is a fully fledged technological leap with a brand new engine and a cutting-edge airframe, bringing them straight into contention with Western air forces in around 14 months. Even taking into account the purchase of the Rolls-Royce engines, even when compared to the middle of World War II, with the entire nation's budget going into defense, that kind of progress is simply unheard of. Which returns us to the question that started this paragraph, and funnily enough, this entire video. How the hell did they do it? And why is the answer to that question so controversial? Well, to explain that, we are going to have to tell both versions of the story. So we will start with the Soviet narrative and go through the entire development history of the MiG-15, and then we will discuss the Western version of events. Anyway, let's go! When design proposals were being floated for what would become the MiG-15, the engineers at Mikoyan Gurevich were faced with a quandary. In the 1930s, German aerodynamicists had published several papers on the properties of swept wings and their potential benefits for achieving high-speed flight while retaining control of the aircraft. The main issue with aircraft as they approach higher speeds is that due to how lift surfaces work, i.e. generating a pressure differential and then directing the faster moving air over the top of the wing downwards to suck the aircraft into the air essentially, if you go fast enough, the air flowing over the top of the wing goes faster than the speed of sound. And unless your aircraft can go fast enough to push through that barrier, when you hit it, the air passing over the wing starts generating supersonic shockwaves while the rest of your aircraft is still subsonic, which in turn disrupts airflow and delaminates the wing, resulting in a loss of lift as well as control over the flight surfaces, a phenomenon known as compressibility. Now, prior to World War II, this hadn't been a problem. The engine technology and the aerodynamic properties of biplanes meant no one could get near that speed to have to worry about it. But as the faster monoplanes began appearing and World War II's impetus for technological advancement went into overdrive, all the major aviation designers working for the world's great powers ran into the same wall. Me-262s, despite having their swept wing, would disassemble themselves mid-flight after overspeeding. The P-38 had an especially nasty habit of losing its flight controls, and the Yak-3, though magnificent, would start shedding parts due to the shockwaves ripping through the airframe. Thus, everyone got to work testing various solutions to the issue, and ultimately everyone reached the same conclusion. Swept wings were the future. In 1943, after the Soviet rocket fighter program met with rather explosive disasters after going transonic and losing control, Tsargi had been researching the potential of the swept wing at length. They tested literally every configuration, testing the various formulas and combinations of angles, slight sweep, extreme sweep, reverse sweep, until finally releasing their findings to the various design bureaus in early 1945, with the request that the design teams come up with various test beds to experiment in real-world conditions. And the MiG Bureau was the first to oblige. Behold this adorable little aircraft, the MiG-8 Utka, or the Duck, a name which should be self-evident. Using the MiG-8, the Bureau's designers quickly began unraveling the unknown variables in swept-wing aircraft, how the wing behaved at different angles of attack, in different weather and wind conditions. Every conceivable test was run on the fundamentals to see how the wing performed, the results of which they provided to Tsargi, who then combined their research with captured German technology and began strapping the rocket engines from Me-163s to swept-wing gliders designed by Pavel Vladimirovich Tsibin from OKB-256. These goofy but glorious aircraft achieved speeds in excess of 700 miles an hour, while retaining full control of their flight surfaces, and this was just the first stage. One of the German engineers voluntold to join the Red Air Force's shenanigans, one Hans Rossing, was teamed up with the rocket plane designer Berezyak to finish a project started in Germany, a project designated the DFS-346. It was intended to be a long-range reconnaissance aircraft using a more advanced variant of the Me-163's rocket motor, the Walther 509 Mark C, or cruiser engine. And this engine had two combustion chambers and operated like a modern liquid rocket engine in that it could be throttled up and down or even turned off, allowing for a longer flight time. Combine that capability with a very aerodynamic airframe which included an escape pod for the pilot, who flew the aircraft while lying down, and according to the designers it had a theoretical top speed of Mach 2.5, though I'm pretty sure that was the late war dodgy batches of Privyet talking. Nevertheless, the Soviets built several of the things, and while it was obviously unsuccessful, resulting in many catastrophic accidents and a few explosions, it did lead to their supersonic aircraft projects with the Biznovat Bureau under the direction of Matus Biznovat, who further refined Soviet research into high-speed flight and would later become the head of Soviet air-to-air missile programs. But his story is a story for another time. Getting back to the main plot, the designers at MiG were confident that swept wings were the way forward. However, this came with its own challenges, as the Aviation Ministry's requirements for the next generation fighter project were daunting to say the least. It had to fly at 1,000 kilometers an hour, or 600 miles an hour. It had to be agile enough to dogfight while mounting two 23mm cannons and one 37mm cannon to destroy bombers. As well as being easy to fly, it had to be rugged and have rough field capability, so it could operate from frontline air bases, and as a result of that requirement, it also had to be easy to maintain under combat conditions by short-term conscripted ground crews. All of this was, quite frankly, absolutely ridiculous given where they were starting from. To put this into perspective, that's like the DoD going up to Lockheed today and demanding an aircraft with the lethality of an F-22 Raptor, the maintenance requirements of a Cessna, and the operational flexibility of a de Havilland Canada Beaver. The reaction to this, of course, was a collective sigh, heads buried in hands, and a cry of how in the name of Lenin are we going to build this thing? Initially, when they heard a new engine was available, they thought the solution was going to be pretty straightforward. Simply replace the unreliable German engines in the MiG-9 with a single RD-45 Nien. You then streamline the fuselage and it should be all good. However, given all the issues the MiG-9 was suffering through at the time, and the insane requirements put forth by the leadership, this was quickly abandoned. Next, they considered a twin-boom arrangement with split intakes to give better forward visibility while eliminating the gas ingestion problem from the nose-mounted armament. But this too was ruled out due to the amount of drag such a design would inherently involve, as well as the complexity of the construction. After a few months of preparatory design work, it became clear that the simplest solution was the best one. Centrifugal jets like the Nien, due to their method of compression and combustion, or the suck, squeeze, banging and blowing, are inherently wide rather than long. So instead of making a sleek and highly refined turbojet design with hydraulic controls and wing-mounted intakes and all these fancy gizmos, you build an aerodynamic shell just big enough to house the guns, a cockpit, some fuel, and the engine. Sweep all the flight surfaces at around 35 to 38 degrees, put on some really beefy landing gear to allow for rough field operations, and hey presto, you have yourself a bargain basement jet fighter that will work wherever you send it and go like the absolute clappers. You're just gonna have to fix it a lot. Thus, Project I-310 was born. A cigar-shaped aircraft with swept wings, big guns, and a bigger engine. And then they immediately ran into a problem. For all the power the new engines granted them, early jets didn't have anything like the immediately available thrust of modern afterburning turbofans. And with the 35 degrees of sweep, the slender, high-performance aluminium wing proposed by Tsagi didn't generate anything like enough lift at slow speeds to provide the takeoff performance required by the Air Force for frontline airfields. In its initial configuration, it would need a takeoff run that only a fully equipped airbase with a paved runway could provide, invalidating the entire purpose of the aircraft. But after having committed to the swept wing design, they couldn't very well go back and rework the entire aerofoil. So then they decided, what if we could have the efficiency of a straight wing on takeoff and landing, while being able to manually sweep the wings back after getting up to speed. Oh yeah, that's right. The guys at MiG were actually considering variable geometry wings in 1947 as the frontline fighter for the entire Soviet Air Force, the Mad Lads. Unfortunately, like the Germans, they realized that the technology required just wasn't there yet, and it would be prohibitively expensive. I wish I could find the concept drawings for the Swing Wing MiG-15 though. That sounds insane. If someone's an artist, draw it. I want to see it. In the end, they decided on reducing the wing loading by enlarging the aerofoil, which naturally led into another serious engineering problem regarding the landing gear. They couldn't put it in the fuselage, as that's where the engine, fuel, avionics, and everything else was. They had to go into the wings. And they had to be heavy-duty gear too for rough field operations, which meant more weight. Weight they had just spent all their time trying to counteract. They had designed this absolutely beautiful, streamlined, lightweight, 3-spar wing with absolutely incredible performance that was now completely useless. They tried changing it to a twin spar, adjusting the landing gear's position relative to the fuselage, but that only made it conflict with the mandatory hardpoints for bombs and external fuel tanks. The only thing they could do was revert it to a strong, rigid main spar made out of solid steel to support the gear while retaining as much of the performance as feasible. Except when they sent it to Sagi for testing, the scale models and prototypes snapped in two from the weight. In switching to this design, they had inadvertently created a strong reinforced core section while keeping the high-performance build of the previous wing. And what happens when you have a lightweight construction attached to a stronger central structure that is subjected to intense twisting force? Under high G-stress or extreme torsion, caused by aerobatics at speed, the wings would literally snap in half. Youch. It should be pointed out here that this was the first time the Soviets had ever designed a high-performance jet fighter independently, so they essentially had to run this entire program via trial and error. Therefore, this sort of trouble is to be expected. It took months of grueling testing and constant tweaking, but eventually they found a compromise position which met their performance requirements while retaining key design criteria. However, this problem of torsion forces snapping the wings would be a constant issue on the early models of MiG-15, and made it into the pilot handbook as a known hazard to be wary of should they exceed the airframe's safe operating parameters. This would later get fixed through various phases of strengthening the entire wing, yet as we will see, that would eventually cause problems of its own. With this done, they had climbed over their biggest hurdle. All they needed to do now was work out how to integrate the engine and the armament while avoiding the massive disaster that befell the MiG-9. They were lucky in the sense that the centrifugal configuration of the Nien meant the ingestion of propellant gases from the guns would pose less of a problem, due to the diffusion across multiple chambers and overall reliability. Nevertheless, it was still an issue they had to be wary of. Then there was the center of gravity of the aircraft. The fuselage-mounted engine was fantastic aerodynamically. However, in an experience reminiscent of the P-39 Aerocobra, this tended to throw the center of gravity out of whack. Thankfully for them, though, the Red Air Force had a lot of experience with the P-39. And here is where the Soviet tendency of integrating redundancy and simplicity, as well as their frontline experience during World War II, proved its worth. Saying something is the AK-47 of insert a type of machine or vehicle here is a worn-out cliched trope. A situation not helped due to the idiocy of the Pentagon reform movement, led by Pierre Sprey, James Burton and John Boyd, perpetuated by their sycophantic army of internet drones. And this idiocy has caused an exaggerated reactionary and, in my opinion, unfair backlash of revisionism against the pragmatic aspects of Soviet design. Yet keep in mind, this isn't the era of digital weapon systems, GPS and laser-guided munitions or supercomputers. And even in the modern day, after those platforms entered widespread use, the Ukrainian Air Force has proved they could stay combat effective using older Soviet designs while completely outmatched, sustaining their force on frontline airfields and highways as part of an integrated air defense system, despite the fact that defeat seemed all but certain as Russian tanks were rolling towards Kiev. So when I say the MiG-15 is the pinnacle of rugged Soviet pragmatism, I mean it as the highest compliment. Because the solutions to these problems were elegance in simplicity. The cockpit and avionics package, being placed low down inside the forward fuselage, gave better aerodynamic performance while retaining decent visibility. This had the downside, however, of necessitating a split intake with ducts running along either side of the fuselage, which posed the same problem they had to contend with on the MiG-9. Where do they mount the guns? Well, utilizing the aerodynamic benefits of the cockpit configuration, they used it as a net trade-off and mounted the guns directly underneath the intake with fume extractors and a muzzle brake on the 37mm. The genius part is, though, because they mounted it in a completely separate compartment under the intake instead of part of the intake itself, it didn't conflict with any of the avionics systems, which allowed them to essentially create a self-contained armaments package. The ammo magazine and the guns themselves were mounted in a modular weapons bay attached to 4 retractable cables. This allowed the ground crew to remove the entire assembly for maintenance and rearming within minutes. They could do this really quickly, and this reduced turnaround time by an insane degree, and it didn't even need any special facilities to do, as the entire mechanism was fitted to the aircraft itself. Now they have a fighter whose guns not only work, they work exceptionally well. With that resolved, we are left with the center of gravity issues, and once again, the split intake posed a problem. The cockpit, landing gear, fuel system, and avionics are, as we've established, ever so slightly in the way. This meant the air had to twist and turn around all of these obstacles, getting slower and bleeding efficiency before it got to the compressor. And then, once it got there, this fat, heavy centrifugal jet would send its red-hot exhaust down the length of the cigar-shaped fuselage, causing it to overheat, warp, or even melt and catch fire. So how did they fix it? Well, they fixed it by laying some massive pipe. No, seriously. They resolved both the center of gravity and the thrust-to-heat ratio problem by moving the engine forward to just behind the main spar, reducing the length of the fuselage in the process, and then fitting a long, girthy jet pipe to diffuse the heat. This killed 2 birds with 1 stone, and added yet another benefit to maintenance. By fixing the engine to the main spar, the fuselage wasn't bearing any weight, nor did it contain any complex or critical components besides the rear control surfaces. Thus, the entire rear fuselage was fitted to a series of latches and was completely detachable. Working on the engine or on any of the other rear-mounted components could be done within an hour by a competent ground crew using simple procedures. There were also a number of other novel features, including an instrument landing system and a radar altimeter. Later versions also included a gun camera mounted just above the intake, and in the advent of the missile age, a countermeasures dispensing system fitted in the tail. But you can only learn so much in scale and wind tunnel testing. So, on the cold, wintry morning of December 30th, 1947, at Ramenskoye Air Base just south of Moscow, test pilot Viktor Nikolaevich Yuganov began his walk-around of the I-310 prototype designated S-1. The weather conditions were marginal at best. There was a low cloud base and a worrying crosswind, with snow forecast for later in the day. The MiG Bureau executives recommended postponing the test until early 1948, not wanting to risk the first prototype until a second was available as backup. But Yuganov was determined to fly. The glory of testing the Soviet Union's latest and most powerful aircraft in defense of the party and the people was too much to pass up. Which is what went on the report to Moscow. In reality, he was broke as fuck, and test pilots got 10,000 rubles of hazard pay when performing the first flight of an aircraft, and he wanted that bonus. Climbing in, he tested the controls. They were heavy. There were no hydraulic assists or fancy all-moving tailplanes on this bad boy. Nothing but Soviet steel and the strength of its bravest sons could control this machine. Starting up the Rolls-Royce engine, he checked temperatures and RPM. Both good. Releasing the parking brake, he taxied to the runway and opened the throttle, thundering into the sky and into aviation history. The MiG-15 was born. The performance of the aircraft was excellent right out of the gate. All the long and tedious work they'd done up to that point had paid serious dividends. Most of the changes made were small adjustments to improve overall performance, such as a simpler canopy design with better visibility, strengthening the mounting brackets for the guns to improve accuracy by reducing spread, moving the wing position back slightly for better aerodynamics, enlarging the size of the ailerons and increasing the wing anhedral by 1 degree to improve roll performance, improving the hard points for larger external tanks and bombs, while adding a compartment for a recon camera to give the MiG-15 true multi-mission capability. Throughout these early test flights, there wasn't a need to make any drastic changes. Then, once the backup aircraft had been assembled, they moved to the next phase: stress testing and acceptance trials. And it is here where we have a spectacular return to form for Soviet aviation. Because it is time for Smechalka. Before being approved for production, an aircraft has to go through comprehensive maneuvering tests in order to identify any handling characteristics that could be potentially hazardous. This is standard procedure for every air force in the world, and when the MiG-15 entered into the testing phase, everything seemed to indicate it would not only meet, but exceed expectations. When mounted with an RD-45F or a Neen Mark II, the MiG-15 could get up to Mach 0.93, which was blisteringly fast for the time. However, when it started approaching transonic speeds at around Mach 0.8, strange phenomena began occurring. The aircraft began losing lateral stability due to the airflow characteristics over the swept flight surfaces. Instead of going into compressibility, the aircraft would start weaving side to side without control inputs from the pilot, or snaking as it's known. The engineers compensated for this by enlarging the vertical stabilizer, elevators, and rudder, but the issue still persisted. Unsure of the cause, further testing revealed that the new thicker variant of swept wing they've added to fix the wing snapping problem would generate a considerable amount of nose-low pitch due to the wingtips being behind the center of gravity. However, when the span-wise airflow went supersonic, the lift over the wingtips would evaporate. Thus, the aircraft began to pitch up. Their solution to this problem was to disrupt the airflow and slow it down with wing fences, which is why Soviet aircraft of the period feature them so prominently. This made the aircraft exceedingly stable, while also helping to resolve the snaking issue in conjunction with the tail. Yet in studying this phenomena, they rapidly became aware of a nasty habit present in the MiG-15's flight characteristics. For some reason, at varying speeds and altitudes, the aircraft had a tendency to suddenly suffer asymmetric airflow over one of the wings, causing what's known as wing drop. The randomness of it was slightly terrifying, as the pilots weren't sure precisely when it would occur, as the phenomena varied from aircraft to aircraft. The only consistent factor in the situation was the faster they went, the worse it got. Worse still, if the MiG-15 exceeded Mach 0.92 while carrying out aggressive combat maneuvers like pulling out of a dive or making a sharp defensive turn, this wing drop would transition into a high-speed, high G-force wingtip stall, as the wing fences were overpowered by the spanwise airflow, which, when combined with the unique aerodynamic properties of the swept-back T-tail, caused the MiG to suddenly and violently pitch up, while the asymmetric airflow caused the dropped wing to aggressively torque roll, snapping the MiG into a spin, while potentially ripping off the control surfaces and G-locking the pilot in the process, which, at low altitude, was universally fatal. This is, as they say, suboptimal. Yet here comes the moment you've all been waiting for. Breathe in, everyone. You've been waiting for this the whole video. I haven't had a chance to say it yet. It's time for the tagline. Are you ready? Get ready. You've been waiting for it. And then it got worse. At these higher Mach numbers, the shockwaves caused by the airflow over the wings would once again cause compressibility, negating the improvements made by the sweep and the wing fences. And because the MiG-15 has a T-tail, those shockwaves actually caused not only the controls to freeze, but it also delaminated the airflow over the tail as well. So at higher speeds and altitudes, the snaking issue would return, as well as increasing the risk of a spin, which wouldn't be such a massive issue if it wasn't for the fact that the spin characteristics of the MiG-15 were absolutely god-awful. The various design features of the aircraft really were conspiring against it here. The anhedral wing design used to increase roll rate had some nasty side effects for stability when pulling high G turns. Likewise, the elevator authority on the MiG was exceedingly high at low to medium speeds due to being mounted as far back on the airframe as physically possible. This was done in order to increase the turn rate. With the wing fences installed, these issues were mitigated when doing climbing turns or maneuvering in the pure vertical, as they provided increased levels of stability at higher angles of attack. Thus, if the pilot managed to keep the MiG at optimal turning speed, known as corner speed in the business, its superior acceleration combined with these aforementioned factors made it the most lethal dogfighter in the world in terms of agility and turn rate. However, if you are turning in the flat horizontal, or in a diving turn with the throttle at military power, or if you pull back on the stick too quickly, or let the speed build up too much, the wing drop phenomena would return with a vengeance most foul, resulting in a sudden wingtip stall that yanked you into a spin. And when entering that spin, the MiG would once again violently pitch up and only then sink into the worst type of spin of all, a flat spin. And this flat spin would then go for several revolutions, switch to a normal steep spin, then back into a flat spin, then, if things were really awful, it would then flip you into an inverted spin. During the spin testing phase of the development trials, the VVS chief test pilot for acceptance trials, Yakov Bogdanov, was killed in the second prototype after being unable to recover from an inverted spin, even with anti-spin rockets mounted on the aircraft. With their chief test pilot for the MiG-15 dead, Mikoyan decided to bring in an expert from another bureau, Sergei Grigorievich Brovtsev. He was the chief test pilot of several cutting-edge designs from the team over at Lavochkin, and he had the most experience flying swept-wing aircraft in the Soviet Union. If anyone could work this problem out, it was him. Testing the various aspects of the aircraft's performance in different speed envelopes, he noted that at slower speed on approach to landing, the MiG's aileron authority was awful, while at higher speed the control surfaces required an excessive amount of stick force to operate efficiently. The lack of hydraulic assists was a serious weakness in that regard, but they could fix that issue on later models, that wasn't a problem. Yet he still couldn't explain the spin behavior or the wing drop. Pushing the MiG into several spins, Brovtsev went through the recovery process in each circumstance. If he caught the spin early or at a slower stalling speed, recovery was relatively normal. Opposite lock on yaw and roll controls in relation to the spin direction, followed by pointing the nose down. Get your speed back up, get her under control, standard procedure. However, in snap stalls, high-speed wing stalls, and irregular spins at high angle of attack or while inverted, the MiG was borderline uncontrollable. Brovtsev was fighting the controls every step of the way, only to see that the more that he fought, the worse it would get. Then, on instinct, he made the decision that if trying to fight the spin would cause it to intensify, what if he just leaned into the spin instead? Brovtsev reversed his control inputs and sure enough, the MiG returned peacefully to level flight, perfectly under control. He went through this process several more times to confirm his findings, and sure enough, he could replicate the results every time. Later investigation would show that under extreme conditions or at high speeds, the delaminating effect on the tail surfaces mentioned earlier would cause seriously strange aerodynamic behavior that had the effect of reversing the MiG-15's controls. High speeds or unnatural flight parameters would cause the aircraft to develop a mind of its own, pitching, yawing, and rolling by itself without pilot input, while requiring a conscious effort by the unfortunate aviator in the cockpit to fight his natural instincts and roll with the aircraft to bring it under control. Brovtsev's testing regime would ultimately save the lives of thousands of young men, as he ensured his recovery procedures were added into the training syllabus for all Soviet MiG-15 pilots. However, for countries outside the Soviet Union with inexperienced aviators who would very soon use the aircraft in combat, namely China and North Korea, this training was not as universally accessible. Everything had to be translated into their own languages, and the quality of their training was seriously compromised by a myriad of socio-economic and political factors, not least of which being that their countries were at that time in direct conflict with the West, requiring pilots to be rushed into service as soon as possible. China was still technically at war with Taiwan, who regularly flew raids against Beijing. In fact, the first air-to-air kill by a MiG-15 would be against a Republic of China P-38 Lightning on a recon mission. while Korea was pursuing its goals of reunification under a monarch... under a democratic People's Republic and the glorious leadership of the Kim dynasty, who were democratically elected, by the way. Eventually, a solution they settled upon was to attach a piece of white tape down the instrument panel aligned with the joystick. Pilots were told to align their stick with the tape and then follow the procedures they'd been told. If the aircraft didn't stop spinning, eject. This is why UN pilots over Korea saw a recurring issue with MiGs spinning out of control during combat. This wasn't helped by the fact that the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force followed a similar strategy used by the Luftwaffe during the Spanish Civil War, and rotated their squadrons as often as possible to give as many Chinese pilots combat experience as they could, while the North Koreans were desperately cutting corners to offset their exceedingly heavy losses, resulting in large numbers of inexperienced and undertrained pilots getting themselves into serious situations they were ill-equipped to get themselves out of. Though I should point out here that the documented instances of spins encountered by the UN pilots number at around 50 to 100 throughout the entire 3-year period of the Korean War. Compare that with the overall sortie rate in excess of 700,000 from the UN side, and between 70 to 100,000 from the communists. Now granted, those aren't all MiG encounters, and they aren't all fighter sweeps, but it does put into perspective that this phenomena wasn't nearly as prevalent as Western commentators make it out to be. Furthermore, instances of the spinning started to drop as pilot experience and training improved across the board. Yet more importantly, that also indicates something else. It goes to show that the Soviets also managed to largely resolve the wing drop issue. Otherwise, Korean War casualty figures would have been an awful lot higher. So what the hell was causing it? Well, you know how I promised you guys some smakalka? Buckle the fuck in. After Brovtsev's tests didn't reveal the problem, the MiG engineers took the S-3 prototype back to their workshop and pulled it completely apart down to the individual bolts, going through every component. They then examined the S-1 prototype in comparison to the blueprints, and what they found sent them into a panic so frantic, they inspected every pre-production airframe on the factory floor to confirm their worst fears. And confirm them they did. Every single MiG-15 had their own unique pair of asymmetric wings. You heard correctly. Each MiG-15's aerofoil was unique, and in every case, one wing was different from the other. One would have a slightly shorter left wing, another would have a slightly wider right wing. There was absolutely no standardization across the entire fleet. It turned out the factories producing the MiGs were unable to precisely follow the schematics provided by the designers, and the same issues with quality control that had plagued Soviet aircraft manufacturing in the past years were still hanging around, despite the massive attempts at reform after the various debacles during World War II. It was a disaster. Every single MiG-15 had asymmetric wings, and no one could be sure which wing was which, and as a result, no idea which wing would drop. It got so bad that Artyom Mikoyan himself ended up going to the plant producing the aerofoils and threw his brother's name around like a sledgehammer. I have a line directly to Stalin personally, and I swear on Friedrich Engels' holy name that if y'all don't get your collective shit together, there will be a Siberian company picnic in the near future. This added motivation improved the situation, but without total reform it wouldn't be possible to resolve the issue entirely, and pursuing that level of reform would delay production, which, as we've established across 2 episodes by now, is an unacceptable option in the Soviet Union. So how did they fix it? Smakalka, which in this case took the form of trailing edge wing extensions, colloquially known as knives by the Soviet ground crews. Essentially, they would get a strip of pressed aluminium in the same shape as the MiG's aerofoil, and then attach it to the back of the wing. Then, once the aircraft was ready for delivery to the Air Force, they would take it on a high-speed test flight to find out which wing would drop. And once they found that out, the ground crew would grab their hammers and manually adjust the knives on the back of the wing to counteract the roll, essentially creating a permanent trim tab to cancel out the uncommanded roll. And this actually worked. Granted, it didn't completely solve the problem, and if the pilots pushed their aircraft too far, the wing drop would still occur. But at least now it would only happen if you properly screwed up. They didn't stop there though. Later models of the MiG-15 had hydraulic actuators installed in the aileron control circuit to further improve roll performance, as well as an automatic speed brake system that would deploy the air brakes if you exceeded Mach 0.92. And as production continued, they got better at building them until eventually the knives would no longer be required. And you guys want to know the ultimate irony? The phenomenon discovered by the MiG engineers regarding the random pitch-up when going transonic, this problem that started all of these issues in the first place, it actually had its own name in the West. And that phenomena's name in the West was the saber dance. Because North American aviation would run into the exact same issues on the F-100 Super Sabre, which had an absolutely diabolical safety and reliability record. So in a twist of supreme irony, the MiG-15's flaws would end up being named for its arch-rival by the West, after they'd already been fixed in the Soviet Union on the MiG-17. Oh, and in case you're wondering why the MiG-17 has such a distinct and unique wing shape, this whole story is why. But we'll get to the 17 later on. The MiG-15, despite its rocky start, ended up becoming one of the most successful fighter aircraft in the history of combat aviation, with over 15,000 examples being built. Soviet pilots ended up scoring a 1-to-1 kill ratio against their American foes, despite being heavily outnumbered by the close of the Korean War. And once equipped with Klimov's VK-1, the definitive variant, the MiG-15 bis, proved itself to be superior in almost every aspect to its NATO counterparts, with the exception of top speed and horizontal turning performance at high altitude. Its dominant capability forced the RAF to face its nightmare scenario, leading to their ultimate humiliation in purchasing F-86 Sabres as their frontline fighter, as no domestically built fighter in Britain could compete with the Soviet design. The RAF livery does look sick though. In fact, the Americans were so vexed as to how the Soviet aviation industry managed to produce such a world-beating aircraft, they initiated Operation Moolah, offering a cash reward of $100,000, which was a lot of money in those days, to the first pilot who defected to South Korea with a fully combat-loaded MiG-15. Yet, funnily enough, the pilot who ended up collecting that bounty wasn't even aware it existed. He quite understandably just wanted to get the hell away from Soviet communism. Flight Lieutenant No Cum Sok, shut up, stop snickering at the back, landed at Kimpo Air Base a couple of weeks after the war in Korea ended on September 21st, 1953, turning his fully combat-ready MiG-15 over to American authorities. The aircraft was immediately packed up and shipped to the United States for extensive testing by the first man through the sound barrier himself, Chuck Yeager. The test results revealed all the issues mentioned up to this point. However, it also noted that its service ceiling, low to medium altitude performance, climb rate, acceleration, armament, and overall dogfighting performance was exceptional. It also nearly killed Chuck Yeager, who, like a madman, climbed up to 50,000 feet and then nosedived the MiG to see how fast it would really go. He tried to get this bird supersonic, and he only barely recovered and actually physically bent the control stick out of shape in the high G pullout at the bottom of his dive. And if you want to see what that looks like, you can go see this exact aircraft in the National Museum of the United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson Air Base to this very day. However, speaking of the US Air Force Museum and the sheer disbelief of the United States Air Force as to how good the MiG-15 was, we have now reached the controversial part. Because this whole story was the Soviet version of the story, where hard work, extensive research, and endless experimentation combined with their ingenious Russian pragmatism created a world-beating aircraft. Sure, it may have had a British engine, yet even that story was filled with engineering brilliance and expertise in espionage that resulted in them building a better engine than the Nien, so even that doesn't detract from the accomplishment. Yet some Western historians refute the true indigenous origin of the MiG-15, saying it wasn't a Soviet design at all, but actually a German design stolen at the end of the war and then refined into the MiG-15. This is, of course, categorically denied by Eastern historians. Yefim Gordon, the authority on Soviet aviation history, discounts this possibility from the research he's done on the subject. Soviet historians and archivists at the time firmly denied this accusation, though this is unsurprising. And one modern article I had translated from a Russian website referred to this version of events, and I quote directly here, as Hitlerite nonsense, as though the Germans were committing some form of stolen valor in retrospect. So the question remains, where does this assertion of plagiarism come from? Well, back in 1945, after the duel of the evil mustache men ended in the Charlie Chaplin impersonator giving himself a 9mm facial, the Red Army's counterintelligence unit, known as Smersh, began sweeping through the government quarter of Berlin, searching for anything of value. The Chancellery had been blown to hell, the Reichstag was not much better, but the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, aka the German Air Ministry if you're boring and don't want to say Luftfahrt, who doesn't want to say Luftfahrt? It sounds amazing, was captured completely intact. Apparently, the staff had either joined the city's defense or made the smart decision and gotten the hell out of Dodge. Regardless, the Luftwaffe's entire archive of secret projects, plans, and technical details had fallen into Soviet hands, along with several of Albert Speer's dispersed aviation factories, one of the largest belonging to Focke-Wulf. Among this bounty, they had acquired a full collection of schematics and a wind tunnel model for a new type of jet fighter proposed by Focke-Wulf's chief designer, Kurt Tank, featuring a fuselage-mounted engine, a swept wing, and the horizontal stabilizer mounted in a T-tail configuration. Known as the TA-183, this aircraft has become, along with the Horten 229, one of the biggest what-ifs of the Luftwaffe's history, beloved of Verabus everywhere who are convinced that this aircraft, combined with the experimental X-4 air-to-air missiles, would have single-handedly destroyed the US Army Air Force and brought forth a glorious victory for the Aryan Übermensch, saving the Reich from certain defeat. This is, of course, nonsense. The engines weren't available in enough quantity, the ones they had were unreliable, and the X-4 didn't work. But it was still a very advanced design for the time. A jet fighter with swept wings and guided missiles was a harbinger of the future, and the Soviets had just gotten their hands on the motherlode. As mentioned in episode 1, they had gotten a hold of an example of every piece of advanced German technology. V2 rockets, 163s, 262s, and God knows what else. With this treasure trove of scientific data and a full set of blueprints, they could very easily continue the project. And we know for a fact that they did just that with the DS-346. So with all that considered, there is a case to be made that the MiG-15 was, if not a direct extrapolation, heavily inspired by or even derived from the TA-183. Yet this assertion is just hearsay in the court of historical opinion. There's no solid evidence. All the world's major nations had been pursuing this research during the war, and the Soviets were no different. MiG's development of the MiG-8 and its experience during the horror show of the MiG-9 provides a strong basis from which to develop the MiG-15. All they needed was an engine, and we know where they got it from. They openly admit to needing the Nien for their success, and Klimov proved he could build something even better when given the technology behind it. What you'd need is a concrete link between the TA-183 and the MiG-15, a solid line from one to the other. And amazingly, it exists. If you cast your minds back about an hour to the start of this video, the British government was exporting Rolls-Royce engines to anyone who would buy them, regardless of the consequences on the international stage. And one of those export partners drew considerable ire from the United States, who thoroughly disapproved of the regime in charge, that being Juan Perón's Argentina. Well, the engine that was sold to Argentina was the Rolls-Royce Nien, and it was purchased on the behalf of one of the German experts working for the Perón regime, due to completely innocent, purely business-oriented reasons. That German expert was none other than the chief designer of Focke-Wulf, Kurt Tank. Tank, having moved to Argentina along with his colleague and friend Reimar Horten, again, for no reason in particular, was now working to design a domestically made Argentinian jet fighter for the Perón regime. And given the Rolls-Royce Nene was the best publicly available jet engine on the market, that was the engine he selected. With a power plant acquired and the original schematics he'd smuggled out of Germany, Tank made the logical decision to simply adapt his TA-183 design to the technological advances made in the 5 years or so since the war. So, after modifying the fuselage design, taking into account the improvements in aerodynamic research, adjusting for the different dimensions required to mount a centrifugal jet in an airframe designed for a turbojet, this was the result. I think the term the youth use for this situation is, holy airball? He built a swept-wing fighter with a T-tail, a split intake, a 1-degree anhedral on the airfoil, chin-mounted guns, a recessed cockpit with swept-back vertical stabilizer, and on the last prototype, he installed a wing fence to improve lateral stability while reducing span-wise airflow. Because guess what? The Pulky 2, as it was known, had a serious problem with wingtip stall at high speed and uncommanded roll, which you must admit is a remarkable coincidence. Even the development process itself matches up closely with the MiG-15, to the extent that the first prototypes had a shorter tail which had to be increased in size to reduce snaking. Even the air brakes are almost exactly in the same place with a similar configuration. The similarities go so far that features which are credited as unique benefits of the MiG-15 show up on the Pulky 2. Most notably that engine maintenance is simplified by having an entirely detachable tail section, revealing a Rolls-Royce Nene with an extended tailpipe. Now, of course, there are obvious differences in the design. The Pulky 2 has a shoulder-mounted wing as opposed to a middle mount. The longer airframe allows for the landing gear to be mounted inboard inside the fuselage, and the horizontal stabilizer is mounted on top of the tail as opposed to halfway up it. But the fact remains that when the original designer of the TA-183 adapted his design to fit the same engine as the MiG-15, he created a near-identical aircraft right down to the same aerodynamic behavior and overall configuration. Yet even this is not conclusive evidence. Their common design features may just be the optimal configuration for a single-engine fighter using the Rolls-Royce Nene, and thus this is an entirely coincidental development based around the engine. Both teams simply arrived at the same conclusions. I think we have to look elsewhere for our answer here. There were multiple design bureaus looking at competing for the fighter project, and not all of them were conventional in their approach. One of these bureaus being the Ukrainian aircraft manufacturer Antonov. That's right, Antonov. The guys famous for their wide-body cargo aircraft, and the world's most ubiquitous flying brick pretending to be a transport biplane that got shot down by a Huey with a guy leaning out the side with a rifle. Yes, that actually happened during the war in Vietnam, and it was an Air America Huey run by the CIA that got the kill. Anyway, the Antonov Bureau were angling for the new fighter contract, and the design they proposed was this. Look at it. Just look at this glorious thing. The Antonov Type M fighter, nicknamed Masha. If you thought the US Navy's Cutlass was the only wacky flying wing fighter of the Cold War, guess again, bucko. Antonov was planning to build this absolute masterpiece of an aircraft to become the primary frontline fighter of the Soviet Union. Imagine, just imagine, fleets of communist danger Doritos. It would have been glorious. And this concept got so far that Antonov was building test gliders to prove it could be done. Sadly, however, he was ordered to halt work on the project because another challenger had stepped up to compete with MiG for the fighter program. That challenger was the Lavochkin Bureau, who, as we mentioned before, provided the test pilot for the MiG-15 after the loss of their second prototype. The reason being, they had the most experience in swept-wing jets in the Soviet Union. But what had given them their experience? Well, it was this. The LA-160 was never really intended to be a frontline fighter. Rather, it was a further development of the LA-152 mentioned in the previous episode, designed to test the performance of swept wings on jet aircraft with the idea of developing a true frontline fighter once a stronger engine was designed or tactically acquired. And while it features the unique Soviet tadpole fuselage design, the wing shape, sweep angle, and T-tail configuration bears a striking resemblance to the TA-183, especially considering they use the same engine. And when Lavochkin adapted the fighter to use the British Rolls-Royce engines, the result was this. The LA-15 Fantail. Designed around the Rolls-Royce Derwent, this aircraft was smaller than the MiG-15, it was harder to build, and it couldn't mount the 37mm cannon. Maintaining it was harder, and turnaround time was longer. Yet pilots all agreed that in aerial combat between fighter aircraft, aside from a minor reduction in top speed due to a less powerful engine, the LA-15 was superior to the MiG-15 in every respect, especially agility and handling, in particular at higher speeds. Speeds it almost caught the MiG-15 in. When compared to the MiG-15's arch-rival the Sabre, the LA-15 would outclass it in every regard. And of course, the Soviets purchased a limited production run before cancelling the project in favour of the other design. And why? The same answer it always is in the Soviet Union. The MiG-15 was cheaper. Derwent engines were harder to make and more temperamental than the Nene or the VK-1. The wing required much tighter tolerances during manufacture, and finally, they wanted to destroy American bombers. So, say it with me everyone, big gun, go brr. The LA-15 was the better aircraft for air-to-air combat, but not the best aircraft for the Soviet Union, and thus, it was tragically cast aside. Justice for my boy. And after that long and winding tale that went all over the world, we are brought right back to the start. Because that's not the answer to our question. The question: was the MiG-15 and the Soviet fighter program at large just a giant case of intellectual property theft? In my opinion, yes, but actually no. While there is definitely a lot of circumstantial evidence to support the claim, the work done by the various design bureaus is so rigorously documented, as we know communists love bureaucracy, that you can easily trace the lineage of the aircraft down their own unique development cycles all the way through, including why decisions were made and what engineering solutions were used to resolve the various issues encountered. However, that being said, given what we have available and what we know the Soviets managed to grab during Operation Paperclipsky, I am absolutely certain that Sagi used the aerodynamic research done by the Germans and elements of their own research conducted on the TA-183 wind tunnel model when they provided their scientific findings and engineering recommendations to the design bureaus. There are just too many similarities for that not to be the case. Therefore, unless you hold the Western designers to the same standard and consider their aircraft to be plagiarizing German engineering, like those moronic Verabus due to Jack Northrop, despite his flying wings coming out earlier and better than the Hortons, you can't call the MiG-15 a copy without shitting on everyone else for the same reason. Because the Western powers did the exact same thing. And so, the Soviet Union. A country born from the carcass of a feudal empire. A country devastated by a brutal civil war and the single bloodiest conflict in human history, all while being ruthlessly crushed underfoot by one of history's most evil men, ethnically cleansing and murdering his own people by the millions. But now, that tyrant was dead. And against all those odds, against all this adversity, the workers and engineers of the Soviet Union achieved a miracle of technology. They had built a world-beating fighter aircraft, and they were now, at that very moment, clawing their way into the heavens. As one of the young pilots flying those MiGs, by the name of Yuri Gagarin, gazed towards a new frontier of human achievement. One might call it our final frontier. Yet over that horizon, a new threat was approaching. For the capitalists had not been idle. They had lost their monopoly on the atomic bomb, and thus were now trying to ensure their monopoly over its delivery. The arrival of the Boeing B-47 was a rude awakening to the Red Army Air Force. However, it wasn't a critical issue, as the MiG-15 could comfortably counter it. But what was approaching rendered their worst fears manifest. A bomber capable of carrying several solar systems worth of nuclear fission direct to Moscow at a speed and altitude thought impossible for an aircraft of its size. It became apparent that a dedicated all-weather interceptor would be needed to counter this threat. And while MiG would modify its aircraft with all manner of variants to meet demand, from air-to-air refueling to missile testing, ejector seat testing, radars, avionics, and God knows what this is for, it would be down to Lavochkin and Yakovlev to take on the challenge. It was time for interceptor insanity. But that's a story for another time.
広い空を飛び越えて夢を叶えに生まれた英知は我に翼を心にエンジンを与えた高く高くより高く我は翼を得たストライカーだと驚き故郷は静かなり我は未知の飛行にのみ自由に空を飛ぶ